What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today, as usual, we have a dope-ass video to talk about. Today, we are going to be talking about the philosophy of protest, which was inspired by the recent No Kings protest, which just took place last Saturday, all across the nation, which I attended one. So I wanted to just talk about my experience with it and just some thoughts that I had during the process, but also just talk about the philosophy of protest more generally, which I think are encapsulated pretty well by the two opposite poles of the spectrum, which is like the non-violent, peaceful protest of Martin Luther King Jr. and the more radical, militant type of protest by Malcolm X. And while these two were writing in the times of the civil rights movement, I think a lot of what they said just applies to the philosophy of civil disobedience and protest in general. So we're going to talk about them. I, of course, got a little nice Americano brewed. Without further ado, let's get into the video. The first thing I wanted to mention was the fact that these protests, at least for me, felt like just finally like some kind of relief from the political frustration that I know so many of people around the country have been feeling. It's like you can write your senators and your House of Representatives, and I have done that, although not as much as I should, and also engage with grassroots advocacy efforts and things like that. But just for the average person who hasn't quite gone that far into it, that's just kind of like an everyday normal citizen, these protests felt like a way for your voice to like actually be heard in a way that was immediately meaningful and impactful, although we really can't slack on those other policy and advocacy measures as well. But honestly, more than anything, I just felt like the event was sounds kind of weird, but just so fun. Like the way that everybody came out with these super creative signs and protests, and it's just like such a diverse crowd. Like you'll see people that look like I would have profiled this mofo as like a white conservative Trump mom, and here she is waving the most woke sign ever. And there's music and there's speeches, and the whole thing just felt like a really fun community event that really made an impact on just the overall moment of culture right now. It also weirdly brought about like patriotic feelings, for as horrible and dark as America is right now, and just the past in which we originated, there are also, of course, positive aspects to America, like the freedom of speech, the freedom of right to assembly, its diversity. At their core, I really do think American values are good ones. It's just when those values are no longer actually adhered to, or they get corrupted or leveraged against you, that's when obviously things get sour and we start to see the things that we see today. But going to that protest just kind of got the gears going, got me thinking, just about the nature of protest in general. So like I said, we're going to talk about two, obviously it's not limited to these two, but I think two very popular modes of how these protests have been met with. One, the idea that we need to keep it absolutely peaceful and must uphold in a very disciplined measure nonviolence. And then there are those that are on the more, radical times, call for radical measures by any means necessary, embracing a more militant, radical approach like Malcolm X. But I want to start first with Martin Luther King Jr. because I feel like the overall tone of these protests has been a big emphasis on nonviolence. And so just talking about some of the virtues of that, Martin Luther King Jr. is talking about these huge marches that took place widespread across the South, and he talks about some of their effects. He says, merely to march in the public streets was to rock the status quo to its roots. Boycotting buses in Montgomery, demonstrating in Birmingham, and defying guns, dogs, and clubs, while maintaining disciplined nonviolence, totally confused the rulers of the South. If they let us march, they admitted their lie that the black man was content. If they shot us down, they told the world they were inhuman brutes. And again, this is about the civil rights, but you can replace this with just the idea of the working class being shit on, the immigrants being deported completely illegally. You can just very much switch those out and the same principles still apply. And so Martin Luther King Jr. goes on to say, when they finally did reach for the clubs, dogs, and guns, they found the world was watching, and then the power of nonviolent protest became manifest. It dramatized the essential meaning of the conflict, and in magnified strokes made clear who was the evildoer and who was the undeserving victim. Because if protests get violent, there's sort of a plausible deniability. You can sick the police on them, you can sick the dogs, the pepper spray, the rubber bullets, all that, and the whole 9 yards. But if people are acting lawfully, totally non-violently, there is no excuse for just this excessive brutality that's especially shown by institutions like the police. As he says, dramatizes the essential element. This isn't about maintaining order, about maintaining peace. It's about doing harm to people who are showing civil disobedience because they are discontent with the way their government is operating. And non-violent protest is a profoundly powerful tool, Martin Luther King Jr. says. And he says, we need to take all this to the next level. This higher level is mass civil disobedience. Just just like at a massive scale. There must be more than a statement to the larger society. There must be a force that interrupts its functioning at some key point, and by all means, it must be without violence. For instance, at the protest I was just at, they flooded the whole downtown area, and this was true, all across the country. If this was happening regularly, this is not a sustainable thing. This is ultimately disruptive to society. It interrupts its functioning at some key point. And so if this continues, then ultimately mass civil disobedience is a tool that eventually, something's got to give eventually. And as long as the people keep showing out, the government eventually is going to have to roll back on whatever it is that incited the protest in the first place. And related to the nature of community of the protest that I was kind of talking about, there's a really interesting kind of psychological thing Martin Luther King Jr. says here, that mass civil disobedience as a new stage of struggle can transmute the deep rage of the ghetto into a constructive and creative force. And in this place, and obviously, the race stuff has its own kind of relations within it, but in this case, the deep rage of the ghetto is also the deep rage of the country that is being exploited. The working class, who is the backbone of this country, they do all the work, and they don't get to see any of the fruits of the labor. It all goes up to the top 1%, who in turn turn around, manipulate politics in order to further exploit the worker. So mass civil disobedience is a way in which we can transmute the deep rage of the ghetto of capitalism, for instance, into something that is actually constructive and creative. And so obviously I think there is a ton of virtues to this idea of non-violent protest. And the big thing that comes to me is the second you induce violence, that gives them the excuse that they need to just go full on militancy, insurrection mode. As long as we remain non-violent and don't give them an excuse to do this, then I think it becomes a very effective political message. However, on the other hand, we have people like Malcolm X who advocate for a more radical form of protest. How long have the American people been discontent? You could say it's for a very long time. And so at some point you need to get more radical. So, and again, you can agree or disagree with this. This is just Malcolm X's philosophy. And he's talking about the nature of revolution. He talks about the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Algerian all revolutions have one thing in common, and ultimately that is some degree of bloodshed. He says there is no such thing as non-violent revolution. You can do protesting, you can, exercise your civil disobedience, but, don't go around calling it a revolution. The only kind of revolution that is non-violent is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is loving your enemy is the Negro Revolution. It's the only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter. Why is there this double standard where, although, especially in the times of civil rights where police were just absolutely brutalizing and, physically harming, oftentimes, killing, all the different injustices of the civil rights, why is it that we, as we're getting totally shit on, have to be the good guys? And he talks about just a general principle of, life. Be courteous, be peaceful, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. In everyday life, if someone is just constantly antagonizing and provoking and physically harming you, you'd be kind of an insane person just to stand and let it all happen without fighting back at some level. And this is the same principle taking place at society. And at some level, Malcolm X says nonviolent protest is actually nothing more than a sort of anesthetic. It's like this steam valve which lets you get rid of some frustration, but all the while the government gets to maintain its status quo while letting the people feel like they are voicing their dissent. And so he gives an analogy. He says,
keep us passive and peaceful and non-violent. It's like when you go to the dentist and the man is going to take your tooth. You're going to fight him when he start pulling. So they squirt some stuff in your jaw called Novocaine to make you think they're not doing anything to you. So you sit there, and because you got all that Novocaine in your jaw, you suffer peacefully. Blood running all down your jaw. And you don't know what's happening because someone has taught you to suffer peacefully. The white man do the same thing to you in the street.
So the Novocaine in this case is basically, the right to assemble, the right to do non-violent protests. But, all the while, the dentist, which is to say, like, the capitalist structure, the government, is still pulling your tooth, pulling all your laborers, exploiting you and, the masses of people to better themselves. And meanwhile, we've got our Novocaine, but all the while, there's blood running down our jaw because we have learned to suffer peacefully. And he gives an example of, for instance, violent protests that took place in Birmingham. He says the protesters, began to stab the crackers in the back and bust them upside the head. Yes, they did. That's when Kennedy sent in the troops down in Birmingham. After that, Kennedy got on the television and said that this is a moral issue. That's when he said he was going to put out a civil rights bill. So as a direct consequence of this violent, immediate, disruptive, and radical form of protesting, well, all of a sudden now things that people have been trying to get past for decades, all of a sudden people are making moves. For instance, with the Black Lives Matter protests, if I remember, that's when body cameras and, real scrutiny on the police force started taking place, at least at some level, at a very widespread degree. And it just makes sense. Like, if you are applying a ton of pressure from the hundreds of millions of masses of massive civil disobedience, and you take it at the point where it becomes radical and maybe in some senses violent, whether that be to property damage, widespread property damage, or to actual persons, this is clearly going to have a more immediate and urgent effect on the government and their actions. The question is, however, is it ultimately going to be productive, or is the better way to go with nonviolence, or is there some in between? I'm very curious what other people think about both of these philosophies, what their own philosophy of protest is. Any thoughts that you guys have, I would love to hear them. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching the Big Nate Review. You guys already know to smash that subscribe. You already know to follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews. And thank you guys for watching the Big Nate Review.